They laughed when she started digging at midnight. They laughed when the smell drifted across 3 counties. They laughed when she told them what she was burying beneath every single tomato plant in her 20-acre field. But nobody laughed when Clara Mae Holbrook rolled her harvest into the Oklahoma State Fair that August. Nobody laughed when the judge's jaws dropped. Nobody laughed when the scale tipped past 47 pounds and kept climbing. And absolutely nobody laughed when the Commissioner of Agriculture himself took off his hat, wiped his forehead, and declared what every single person in Dusty Creek had sworn would never happen, that a 24-year-old woman with dirt under her fingernails and fish blood on her boots had just broken every tomato-growing record in the history of the state. But here's the part the newspapers never printed. Clara Mae Holbrook didn't just break a record that day, she survived something that should have killed every plant in her field. Something that did kill every plant in her neighbor's fields. Something that started 3 months earlier, on the worst night of her life, when the sky turned black and the land decided it was finally time to reclaim what had always belonged to it. And if you want to know how a woman who everyone called crazy, a woman who buried rotting fish heads in perfectly good soil, ended up holding a trophy that no man in Oklahoma had ever managed to lift, you need to hear the whole story, because this isn't just about tomatoes. This is about what happens when the world tells you to quit and you decide to dig deeper instead. Clara Mae Holbrook was 23 years old when her grandfather died and left her the worst farm in Butler County. The Holbrook place sat on 40 acres of red clay and broken dreams, 3 miles outside a town called Dusty Creek that even the interstate had forgotten. The house leaned to the left. The barn leaked in 17 places. The well water tasted like iron and regret, and the soil was hard-packed, nutrient-starved. The kind of ground that turned tomato seedlings yellow before they ever dreamed of fruit. Clara's grandfather, Jeremiah Holbrook, had been the last person to coax anything meaningful out of that land. He'd grown tomatoes that people still talked about at the feed store, meaty, scarlet, heavy as a child's heart. But that was 20 years ago, before the droughts came back, before the corporate farms bought up the water rights, before Jeremiah got too old to fight and the land started winning. When Clara drove up that March morning, the fields were brown stubble and dead weeds. For a moment, she thought about turning around. She could have sold the place to AgriCorp for pennies. She could have moved to Tulsa like her mother begged her to. She could have become something safe. But Clara had something the safe jobs couldn't give her. She had a memory. She was 8 years old the last time her grandfather's tomatoes won the state fair. She remembered standing on her tiptoes, her hand wrapped in his calloused fingers, staring up at a tomato so big it cast a shadow over her whole face. She remembered the crowd murmuring, the other farmers nodding with something that looked almost like respect. She remembered the way the autumn air smelled that day, like dust and diesel, and something sweet she couldn't name. And she remembered what Jeremiah whispered that night driving home through the dark. The land doesn't care who you are, Clara Bug. It only cares if you're willing to listen. She'd spent 15 years trying to understand what that meant. Now, standing in 40 acres of Oklahoma hardpan with the deed in her pocket and her grandfather's journal in her hand, she decided it was time to find out. The first person to tell her she was crazy was Earl Ketchum. Earl owned the farm next door, 200 acres of soybeans and attitude. He was 64, built like a grain silo, and had farmed the same way since 1978. If the extension office didn't recommend it, Earl didn't do it. If a woman under 30 suggested it, Earl laughed out loud. Clara met him on her 3rd day, clearing rocks from the north field. "Holbrook's granddaughter," Earl said, leaning on his fence. It wasn't a question, Clara. I'm planning to put tomatoes in this field. Earl laughed, a real laugh from deep in his belly. Tomatoes? Honey, that field hasn't grown anything but heartbreak since your granddaddy's knees went bad. You know what nematodes do to nightshades in this county. I know the soil needs help, Clara said. The soil needs a bulldozer and a prayer meeting. Look, I don't mean to be unkind, but you're young, you're a girl, and you've got 40 acres of clay that hasn't seen a decent yield since the Clinton administration. Plant soybeans like everyone else. I don't want to plant soybeans, Clara said quietly. Of course you don't. You young people always want to be special. But farming isn't about being special. It's about not going broke. He spat in the dirt and climbed on his tractor. Mark my words. You'll be crying to the bank by July. Clara watched him drive away. Then she bent down, picked up another rock, and threw it on the pile. By April, Clara had learned 3 things. First, the soil was worse than she'd thought. Nitrogen levels so low they were practically a joke. Organic matter under 1%. Clay so thick water pooled on the surface instead of sinking in. Second, she was running out of money. The inheritance was disappearing into well repairs. A used tractor that broke down every other day, and heirloom seeds that cost 3 times the cheap hybrids. And third, Earl Ketchum had been talking. It started small. A comment at the feed store, a joke at the diner. But by planting season, half of Butler County knew about the Holbrook girl and her ridiculous tomato dream. The bankers stopped returning her calls. The equipment rental place had nothing available. Even the woman at the seed counter looked at her with pity. You're the one trying to grow tomatoes on the old Holbrook place? That's right. Sweetheart, my husband said you'd have better luck growing tomatoes on the moon. Clara took her seeds and left. That night, she sat at her grandfather's kitchen table and opened his leather-bound journal. She'd read it after the funeral, going through every entry, like a granddaughter in mourning. Now she read it like her life depended on it. On page 47, she found something that made her stop breathing. The entry was dated August 14th, 1987. The year Jeremiah won his last state fair. The fish worked, he'd written, better than I dared hope. The plants by the creek, the ones where I buried the heads, they're twice the size of the control row. The fruit is setting heavy, the color is deeper, and the smell. Martha says the neighbors are complaining, but I don't care. Clara read the entry 3 times. Then she flipped forward. Page 48 mentioned the fish emulsion test. Page 52 had a drawing of a fish skeleton with arrows pointing to tomato roots. Page 61 described the deep burial method. Fish heads planted 18 inches down, a layer of charcoal, then the transplant on top, years of entries. Experiments with different fish species, different depths, different companion plants. A whole secret history hidden in a journal everyone had dismissed as an old man's ramblings. The last entry about fish was dated 1994. Too old now. Back won't let me haul the buckets anymore. Letting the method go. Maybe someday someone will pick it back up. Clara's heart pounded. She'd heard of fish fertilizer before. Bottles of fish emulsion sat on every nursery shelf in America. But Jeremiah wasn't talking about pouring liquid around plants. He was burying whole fish heads, skulls, spines, everything, deep in the soil, directly beneath the root zone. It was ancient. It was messy. It was exactly the kind of thing that would make Earl Ketchum laugh until he choked. And according to 40 years of notes, it worked better than anything else he'd ever tried. Clara looked out the window at the north field, bathed in moonlight. The soil was tilled. The rows were marked. 300 tomato seedlings waited in the greenhouse she'd built from salvaged windows. And she had exactly $47 in her checking account. Not enough for commercial fertilizer. Not enough for soil amendments. Barely enough for gas. But 3 miles down the road, At the Dusty Creek processing plant, they threw away 500 pounds of fish heads every day. The man at the plant was named Gus, missing 2 fingers. Didn't ask questions? You want the heads? Lady, we pay people to take them. Just sign this form so you don't sue us for salmonella. I won't get salmonella, Clara said. That's what the form's for, Gus said. She drove away with 50 pounds of fish heads packed in melting ice. The smell was immediate and profound. The smell of the ocean having a bad day, of every cat in Dusty Creek making urgent plans. By 11, the moon was high and white, turning the red clay silver. Clara backed the truck to the edge of the north field, pulled on her grandfather's rubber boots, and lifted the first bucket. Catfish heads mostly, some buffalo mixed in, cloudy eyes, scales catching moonlight like broken glass. The ice had melted to pink slush that soaked through her gloves and made her stomach turn. She carried the first bucket to row 1, plant 1. She'd spent the afternoon digging test holes, measuring exactly 18 inches down. Now, by lantern light, she began. The first hole took 10 minutes. 3 fish heads in, a handful of biochar from the wood stove ashes, fill it back up. Move 3 feet left. Start again. By plant 10, her shoulders burned. By plant 20, she gagged on the smell. By plant 50, she talked to the fish heads, apologizing, promising their sacrifice meant something. By plant 100, she stopped looking at her watch. At 3 in the morning, a coyote watched from the fence line, eyes glowing gold. Clara threw at a fish head. It vanished into the dark. At 4, gray touched the eastern sky. She'd buried fish beneath 120 plants. Her back felt like nails had been driven through it. Her hands blistered inside her gloves. She smelled like a dock at low tide. But watching the first pink light touch the horizon, she felt something she hadn't felt since her grandfather died. Hope it lasted exactly until Earl Ketchum drove by. He didn't see her at first, sipping coffee, half asleep at the wheel. Then he saw the truck, the buckets. Clara Mae Holbrook, covered in fish slime and clay, standing in a field that looked like it had been attacked by a smelly army of gophers. Earl slammed the brakes. He rolled down the window, stared. Then he laughed, not the belly laugh from before. This was worse. This was the laugh of a man who had just been given a gift, the gift of knowing he was right and someone else was catastrophically wrong. Fish? You're burying fish? In your tomato in 5? Fish heads, Clara said, too tired to be embarrassed. High in nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, they're high in stink. Good Lord, girl, what did those tomatoes ever do to you? The soil is dead. I'm giving it life. You're giving it a smell that'll carry to the county line. Oh, this is beautiful. I was going to feel bad when you failed. But now I'm going to enjoy watching this. I'm going to bring a chair and a lunch and watch every one of those plants turn black and fall over, Ari. They won't turn black, Clara said. Sure they won't. And I'm the Queen of England. He drove away, laughing, the sound carrying across the fields like a curse. Clara stood there, watching his truck disappear. Then she picked up her shovel, walked to plant 121 and started digging. Word spread faster than the smell. By noon, 3 pickups had slowed to stare. By evening, someone posted a photo on Facebook with the caption, "Local girl loses mind. Film at 11. By week's end, Clara couldn't go to the grocery store without being pointed at. Couldn't check her mailbox without finding notes ranging from condescending to genuinely concerned. Then came Martin Poole, the county extension agent. White truck, government plates, Oklahoma State polo shirt. Polite, professional, absolutely certain she was making a terrible mistake. Miss Holbrook, I've been getting calls, I bet you have. The neighbors are concerned about the biological material you're introducing into the soil. Lap, fish heads aren't biological weapons, Mr. Poole. They're fertilizer, they're unprocessed organic matter. In these quantities, they present risks. Nitrogen burn, Pathogen introduction, pest attraction. The odor doesn't affect the plants, Clara said. No, but it affects property values. I'm not here to shut you down, not yet. But if we receive public health complaints, the county can issue a citation. I understand. Poole looked at her for a long moment. My grandmother used to put eggshells around her roses. Old methods sometimes work. But this isn't eggshells, Miss Holbrook. This is something else. I know, she said. He left her with a composting pamphlet and a warning that he'd be back. Clara walked back to her field. 300 seedlings sat atop buried secrets. The fish heads were decomposing deep in the clay, breaking down into nutrients that would feed the roots for weeks. Or so the journal promised. She knelt beside plant number 1. Small green leaves, not record breakers, but beneath the surface, something ancient was happening. Something the soil testers couldn't measure. Something Earl Ketchum and Martin Poole and the whole Laughing County didn't know about. Clara put her hand on the warm earth and whispered, "Grow, you beautiful things. Just grow." May turned to June, and the laughing didn't stop. Earl made it a weekly ritual to drive by, slow his truck, shake his head. Sometimes he brought friends. Once, Clara looked up to find a carload of farmers passing binoculars, like they were at a zoo. "Still alive," Earl called. "Still alive," Clara answered. "For now," he said, and drove away chuckling. The truth was, Clara wasn't sure the plants would stay alive. The first 3 weeks were agonizing. The seedlings sat in the ground like they were considering death. Leaves small, stems thin, compared to Earl's robust hybrids, which he showed off online with captions like "Real farming, real results." Clara's plants looked pathetic. She started waking at 4 every morning, walking the rows with a flashlight. She talked to the plants, sang to them, played her grandfather's Johnny Cash records, because Jeremiah always claimed tomatoes liked a good bass line. And slowly, impossibly, things changed. The leaves darkened from pale green to something deep and almost black. They thickened, taking on a waxy sheen she'd never seen before. The stems, thin as pencils, began to swell. By mid-June, they were thick as her thumb, with a purplish undertone that made them look muscular. And the roots, Clara dug up a runt on a whim and dropped to her knees. The root system was enormous. Dense white tendrils spreading 3 feet outward, diving deep into clay where no tomato root had business going. Wrapped around them, feeding them, were threads of white mycelium, fungal networks, the sign of healthy, living soil. The fish heads were working, not just as fertilizer, but as something more. Decomposition fed bacteria. Bacteria fed fungi. Fungi unlocked nutrients trapped in the clay for decades. The biochar created tiny habitat pockets, holding water and nutrients exactly where roots needed them. A hidden orchestra playing beneath the surface, and Clara was the only one who could hear it. She replanted the runt and went back to Gus for more fish. By July, the difference was undeniable. Clara's plants were no longer plants. They were bushes, small trees, 4 feet, then 5, then 6. Stems thick as her wrist, leaves so dark and lush they looked artificial. The concrete wire cages were outgrown in weeks, plants spilling over like green waterfalls. And the flowers. Most tomatoes produce clusters of 5 or 6 yellow blossoms. Clara's plants produced clusters of 20, 30, deep golden flowers that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Earl stopped laughing when he saw the flowers. He just slowed, stared, and drove on without commentary. But Clara had no time to enjoy the silence because July in Oklahoma brings the drought. They'd predicted it since March. Maps colored in angry red and orange. Below average rainfall, above average temperatures. Farmers should prepare for a challenging season, but predictions don't prepare you for reality. Day after day of 100-degree heat. Clouds building on the horizon promising rain, then dissolving into nothing. Watching the well level drop an inch a day, doing math about how long before the pump ran dry. The air itself seemed to shimmer, turning distant fields into wavering mirages that mocked every farmer who dared to hope. Cattle stood motionless in pastures, heads low as if the very act of breathing took too much energy. The whole county held its breath, waiting for relief that never came. By the third week of July, Dusty Creek was in drought emergency. The county banned non-essential water use. Soybean fields turned the color of old paper. Corn collapsed into dust. Farmers watched their livelihoods turn to straw. Earl's tomatoes, the ones he'd been so proud of, his proof that Clara was a fool, began to wilt. Leaves curled. Fruit stopped growing. Some plants developed blossom end rot. Others gave up entirely, stems browning from the ground up. Earl irrigated twice a day, then 3 times. He ran his well pump until it groaned, hauled water from town. Did everything conventional wisdom said would work, and still his plants suffered. Clara's didn't. The Oklahoma sun spares no one. But while Earl's field turned yellow and crispy, Clara's stayed green. While his tomatoes stopped at golf ball size, hers kept swelling. While his water bills climbed into thousands, she watered every 3 days and watched her plants thrive. The difference was the fish. Not just nutrients, though the nitrogen and phosphorus helped. It was the structure the fish heads created in the soil. Decomposition left channels in the clay, tiny tunnels letting water penetrate deep instead of running off. The biochar acted like a sponge, holding moisture at the root zone for days after the surface dried. The fungal networks spread like a living irrigation system, transporting water in ways science was only beginning to understand. Clara's roots went down 4 feet. Earl's went down 12 inches. When the drought came, that difference meant everything. But nature doesn't give gifts without taking something in return. In the 3rd week of July, Clara learned her greatest strength had become her greatest vulnerability. It started with crows. A dozen black shapes on the fence line, watching with intensity that made her skin prickle. She shouted. They rose with mocking cries, circling overhead before settling in the oak trees. Next morning, 30. The morning after, 50 crows are smart. Crows remember. And crows can smell fish. The decomposition feeding her plants sent out a chemical beacon, telling every scavenger within 5 miles that food waited in the Holbrook field. At first, just crows, pecking at soil, digging shallow holes, pulling up rotting fish. Clara spent mornings filling crow holes, replanting uprooted seedlings. Then came the raccoons. A family of 6, spotted at midnight in her headlights, fat, confident, completely unafraid. Standing in row 7 with fish heads in their paws, eyes saying, "This is ours now." She tried everything. Pie tins on stakes. Crows used them as perches. Coyote urine around the perimeter. Raccoons rolled in it. Motion-activated sprinkler. They played in it like a water park. By the 1st week of August, she'd lost 10, maybe 15 plants out of 300. Each one a personal defeat. Each uprooted seedling a hole in her story. And then, on the worst night of summer, the sky turned black, a dry thunderstorm, lightning without rain. The kind farmers fear the way sailors fear rogue waves. The kind that brings fire. Clara was asleep when the first bolt hit. She woke to the world cracking open, white light burning patterns into her retinas. She stumbled to the window and saw the ridge behind her north field glowing orange. Lightning had struck a dead oak. The oak burned. And the wind, that merciless Oklahoma wind, carried embers directly toward her tomatoes. She didn't think, she ran. Barefoot, in a t-shirt and shorts, Clara sprinted into the field. Embers fell like snow, small, glowing, deadly. One touched a leaf 3 feet away and it curled and blackened in seconds. She grabbed a shovel, a rake. Beat out embers, stomped them, threw dirt on them, anything to keep them from her plants. The ridge fire grew. A roar like a freight train consuming dry grass and dead trees. Smoke billowed across the moon, turning night the color of rust. The heat pressed against her face like an open oven door. Sparks danced in her hair and she smelled her own singed ends. The firelight turned her sweat to steam on her skin, and for a moment she thought the whole world was ending in flame and smoke. The wind kept blowing embers into her field. Clara fought for an hour. Then 2, feet cut by rocks she couldn't see, lungs burning with smoke, arms aching from swinging the shovel, her throat raw from screaming at the flames. But she wouldn't leave. Plant to plant, row to row, beating out fire falling from the sky like a curse. At some point, she cried, not from fear, though she was afraid, not from pain, though she was in pain. She cried because this was the test. The land had sent everything: bad soil, drought, scavengers, fire, and she was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to let go. Not tonight, she screamed at the burning ridge. Not these plants, not after everything. Whether the land heard her or the wind simply shifted, she never knew. But at 3 in the morning, the fire hit a rocky outcrop and stalled. Embers stopped falling. The roar became a crackle, then a whisper. Clara stood in her field, surrounded by 300 tomato plants that were somehow, impossibly, still alive. Blisters on her hands, burns on her ankles, ash in her hair, tears on her face, a heart forged in the fire she'd just fought. And as dawn touched the eastern sky, she looked at her plants and fell to her knees. They were fruiting. Hundreds of green tomatoes hung like ornaments, swelling with promise. And at the end of row 12, plant 47, the first plant, the first fish head, hung a single tomato already the size of a softball. Clara sat in the ash and dirt and smoke and laughed deep from the belly. The laugh of someone who had paid for hope in blisters and burns and found it still there. She laughed until the sun came up. Then she slept in her field, surrounded by smoke and fish and green growing things, and didn't wake until noon. The next 2 weeks blurred together. The drought continued. The heat continued. But Clara's plants had crossed an invisible threshold, from surviving to thriving, from fighting to dominating. The fruit grew with visible speed. Morning walks revealed tomatoes that had visibly swollen since the day before. The softball on plant 47 became a cantaloupe. The cantaloupe became a watermelon. By mid-August, it was basketball-sized, skin a deep, impossible red that seemed to glow from within. And it wasn't alone. Dozens of tomatoes reached sizes she'd only seen in photographs. 5 pounds, 8 pounds, 12 pounds. Stems groaned under the weight. She built wooden cradles wrapped in soft cloth, holding fruit like sleeping children. The fish smell was gone, replaced by healthy soil, chlorophyll and sugar. Life pushing against every limit. The wind across her field carried green, growing scent. The smell of something impossible happening. Earl didn't drive by anymore. Martin Poole came back, stood at the field's edge with his clipboard, saying nothing for a very long time. Miss Holbrook, these are remarkable. Thank you. I'd like to take samples for analysis. Take whatever you need. He walked the rows like a man in a dream, touching leaves, measuring stems, photographing fruit that barely fit in his hands. He left with soil samples, leaf clippings, and a 6-pound tomato. He also left without the certainty he'd arrived with, the certainty that old methods were superstition and science had all the answers. That certainty was gone, replaced by wonder. The Oklahoma State Fair opens every September. For farmers, it's Judgment Day, the moment when a year's work is weighed against every other farmer in the state. The record, set in 1986 by Walter Crenshaw, was 43 pounds, 7 ounces. It had stood nearly 40 years. Clara loaded her truck before dawn. She chose carefully, not the biggest tomato, but the most perfect. Plant 47, the first plant, the one that started it all, 46 pounds on her bathroom scale. She wrapped it in towels, placed it in a straw-padded crate, and drove 40 miles to Oklahoma City with the crate strapped in the passenger seat, talking to it the whole way. The exhibition hall buzzed. Farmers from across the state had set up displays, red cloths, tomatoes representing years of work and hope. Beautiful tomatoes, large tomatoes, tomatoes that would win any county fair in America. None looked at Clara's crate and felt confident. She sat up at the end of the row, near the fire exit. No red cloth, she'd forgotten to buy one, so she spread a clean work shirt, placed her tomato in the center, stepped back, and waited. Judging started at 10. 3 judges in white coats moved table to table, weighing, measuring, taking notes. Calipers for circumference, checks for blemishes, color uniformity, specific gravity. Clara watched them approach with the same calm she'd felt fighting the fire. She'd done everything she could. The rest was up to the tomato, the soil, the fish heads, and whatever magic brought them together. Dr. Helen Voss headed the judging. 20 years of tomato competitions. She'd seen every variety, every technique, every trick Oklahoma farmers could devise. She took one look at Clara's tomato and stopped walking. Where did this come from? Butler County. Dr. Voss said nothing, just reached for the scale. The tomato went on. The needle climbed. 20 pounds, 30, 40, 43, 44, 45. The needle trembled at 46. Then 47, 47 pounds, 3 ounces. Silence fell over the hall like a blanket. No one moved, no one breathed. The only sound was the hum of fluorescent lights and Clara's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could feel every eye in the room turning toward her, feel the weight of 39 years of history shifting in that single moment. Dr. Voss looked at the scale, at the tomato, at Clara, really looked at her, taking in the sunburned face, scarred hands, boots that had walked through fire. What's your name? Clara Mae Holbrook. Miss Holbrook, Dr. Voss said, voice carrying through the silence. Do you have any idea what you've done? I grew a tomato, Dr. Voss laughed, short surprised. Yes, you certainly did. They announced results at noon. The crowd had grown. Word spreads fast when records might fall. Farmers, families, reporters, curiosity seekers packed the hall, craning to see. In the category of largest tomato, Dr. Voss said, the Oklahoma State Fair has maintained a record for 39 years. Walter Crenshaw, 1986, 43 pounds, 7 ounces. She paused. The hall held its breath. This year, that record has been broken by 3 pounds, 12 ounces. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through corn. The new state record belongs to Clara Mae Holbrook of Dusty Creek, Butler County. 47 pounds, 3 ounces. My colleagues tell me this represents not just the largest tomato ever grown in Oklahoma, but one of the finest examples of the species we have ever evaluated. Applause started slow, then built. Not polite clapping. The sound of people who'd witnessed something they didn't understand, responding with the only emotion that made sense. Clara stood at her table, hands shaking, heart pounding in her throat. Then she saw him. Earl Ketchum stood near the back, good jeans, feed store dust on his collar. Not clapping, just watching. Their eyes met. Clara waited for the laugh, the comment, the reminder that she'd gotten lucky, that it wouldn't happen again, that she was just a girl playing at farming. Earl didn't laugh. He raised his hand, slowly, like it weighed more than her tomato, and touched his fingers to his brow. Not quite a salute, not quite a nod, but the first time he'd ever looked at her without smiling. In that moment, Clara understood what her grandfather had tried to teach her 15 years ago. Respect isn't given. It's grown, inch by inch, row by row, fish head by fish head, until the harvest is so undeniable that even the people who swore you'd fail have to stop and see what you've built. Reporters found her after the ceremony. They wanted her secret, the formula. What fertilizer, what seed, what irrigation system, what magical technology produced a 47-pound tomato? Clara told them the truth. I buried fish heads. They laughed. Of course they laughed. The same laugh from Earl, the feed store, the whole county. The laugh of people expecting a complicated answer and getting a simple one. "What kind of fish?" a reporter asked. Sure, she was joking. Catfish mostly, some buffalo, whatever the processing plant had. How deep? 18 inches. What about soil amendments, pH balancing, nutrient program? Clara looked at the young man with his notepad and deadline, thinking of nights digging in the dark, mornings smelling like the ocean, blisters and burns and tears and hope. "I listened," she said. "Listen to what?" "To the land, to my grandfather, to what the soil was trying to tell me it needed." She picked up her trophy, golden tomato on a wooden pedestal, heavier than it looked. Everyone wanted the newest chemical, latest hybrid, most expensive system, but the land didn't want new. It wanted old. It wanted fish and fire and someone stubborn enough to keep digging when everyone else said stop. The reporter wrote it down. Though he didn't fully understand, that was okay. Understanding would come later, for those who read the article, for farmers asking questions about organic methods, for young women seeing her photo and realizing farming wasn't just a man's game, and crazy ideas sometimes weren't crazy at all. For now, Clara held her trophy, smelled fairground corn dogs, and knew that somewhere in Dusty Creek, 300 tomato plants still grew, still fruited, still proved that old ways had power the new world had forgotten. She drove home with the trophy on the passenger seat, the setting sun turning the Oklahoma sky the color of her biggest tomato. The field waited, the plants waited. Still harvest to do, still winter to prepare for. But turning onto the dirt road, Clara Mae Holbrook did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She rolled down her window, let the wind blow through her hair, warm, dry, smelling of dust and distance, and she laughed. Not the desperate laugh of the fire night, not the vindicated laugh of the fair. She laughed the way free people laugh, the way people laugh when they've paid their dues and found, on the other side of struggle, that the world is wider and wilder than they'd ever imagined. The fish heads were gone now, decomposed, become part of the soil feeding next year's crop. The smell gone, the ridicule gone. Even Earl's laughter faded into something else, not friendship, but a truce, a recognition. All that remained was the land, the plants, the harvest, and the knowledge that sometimes the craziest idea in the room is the only one that works. Clara pulled up to her farmhouse, cut the engine, sat in the silence. Crickets starting, stars coming out. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote waited for her to sleep so it could check the compost pile. She picked up her trophy, climbed out, walked toward her field. Tomatoes gleamed in the moonlight, hundreds of them, red and heavy and impossibly alive. Clara walked the rows, touching leaves, checking stems, whispering the same words she'd whispered all summer. Grow, you beautiful things. Just grow. And they did. They always had, from the first fish head in the first hole on the first midnight, to the record-breaking fruit on the state fair stage, to this quiet moment with nothing but crickets and stars. They had grown, not because the world believed in them, but because one woman with dirt under her fingernails and fish blood on her boots had refused to stop believing. And if you ever find yourself driving through Butler County, Oklahoma, on a warm September night, you might see a light moving through a tomato field long after midnight. Don't be alarmed. It's just Clara Mae Holbrook walking her rows, listening to her land, burying fish heads in the dark. The neighbors don't laugh anymore. But the tomatoes are still laughing, growing, swelling, breaking records, and laughing in their quiet, green, impossible way at everyone who ever said it couldn't be done.